I destroyed my sister's fake charity gala with one phone call and exposed the fact that she'd been stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from me for years. My name is Brianna Cole, and what happened at Le Bernardin that afternoon in Manhattan wasn't just about a lunch invitation gone wrong. It was about finally seeing my sister for who she really was and having the guts to do something about it. Let me back up a little. My older sister Kendall has always been the golden child, the beautiful one, the successful one. While I spent my 20s grinding through college and working my way up to project manager at a tech company, she was modeling, building an Instagram following, and marrying a wealthy businessman named Dylan. Parents adored her. Everyone did. I was just Brianna, the practical one, the boring one, the one who wore Macy's dresses instead of couture. I didn't mind, honestly. I had my own life, my own achievements. We weren't close, but we were cordial. Family dinners on holidays, the occasional text. That surface-level sister relationship where you know each other but don't really know each other. Then, about 6 weeks before that lunch, things started off. Kendall suddenly wanted to reconnect. She invited me to coffee, asked about my work, seemed interested in my life for the first time. It felt nice. Maybe we were finally going to have a real relationship as adults. When she invited me to her charity gala at Le Bernardin, one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York, I was touched. She'd sent a formal invitation in the mail, gold embossed lettering and everything. She'd called me personally. She'd told me it was important to her that I be there. I actually believed her. I took the afternoon off work. I bought a new dress, a beautiful navy number that cost me $200, which felt extravagant for my budget. I had my hair done, wanted to make her proud, to fit into her world for once. I had no idea I was walking into an ambush, or that within the hour, I'd be making the call that would unravel her entire life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a long story, and some of it still makes my hands shake when I think about it. There are parts I've never told anyone. The moments that happened in private, the documents I found, the things I discovered about my own family that changed thought I knew. If you want to understand how a sister can steal from yours while smiling to your face, and how one moment of clarity can bring an entire house of cards crashing down, then stay with me. Subscribe and follow along because you're going to want to hear how this ends. And trust me, the ending is even better than the beginning. It all started the moment I walked through those restaurant doors and saw the look on Kendall's face when she realized I'd actually shown up. The restaurant was stunning. Le Bernardin isn't just expensive. It's the kind of place where you need reservations months in advance and where a single meal can cost more than my monthly car payment. The private event space Kendall had reserved was all floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midwestern Manhattan, crystal chandeliers, and tables draped in cream silk. I walked in feeling excited, nervous, but excited. This was my sister, and for once, she'd invited me. The room was already full of people, women in designer dresses with that effortless, wealthy look, men in perfectly tailored suits, everyone holding champagne flutes and laughing at jokes I probably wouldn't understand. I recognized a few faces from Kendall's Instagram. Socialites, influencers, people whose lives looked perfect in filtered photos. I spotted Kendall near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of impeccably dressed women. She was wearing a white Valentino dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. She looked like she belonged in a magazine spread. I made my way over, smiling, ready to hug her and thank her for including me. That's when I saw her face change. It wasn't subtle. The moment her eyes landed on me, her smile faltered. Just for a second, but I caught it. Something flickered across her expression. Panic? Annoyance? I couldn't quite place it, but it made my stomach tighten. She excused herself from her group and walked toward me quickly, her heels clicking on the marble floor. When she reached me, she didn't hug me. Instead, she grabbed my elbow and steered me toward the hallway outside the event space. Her grip was firm, almost aggressive. The moment we were out of earshot, she dropped my arm and turned to face me. Her expression was cold now, nothing like the warm sister who'd called me 2 weeks ago to confirm I was coming. She asked me what I was doing there. I actually laughed. I thought she was joking. I reminded her that she'd invited me, that she'd sent me a formal invitation, that she'd called me to make sure I was coming. She looked around nervously, like she was checking if anyone could hear us. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She told me that this event was for a certain person, that I didn't fit in, that I needed to leave before I embarrassed her. I just stared at her. I couldn't process what I was hearing. This was the sister who'd been so sweet to me for weeks, who'd acted like she wanted me in her life, And now she was telling me I wasn't good enough to be at her event? I asked her if she was seriously kicking me out. She tried to soften it. She said she wasn't kicking me out. She was just asking me politely to go. Then she said the thing that still makes me sick when I remember it. She told me I was wearing a Macy's dress to an event where people wore couture. She said I didn't belong there. She practically begged me to leave before anyone noticed I was her sister. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just this horrible, clarifying pain. Because in that moment, I understood that all those weeks of reconnecting, all those coffee dates and phone calls, hadn't been about sisterhood at all. She'd been managing me, making sure I'd show up so she could control how I left. But why? Why invite me just to humiliate me? It didn't make sense. I looked past her, back into the event space. I watched the wealthy guests mingling, laughing, drinking champagne that probably cost $50 a glass. I noticed the small printed programs on each table, the ones listing the charitable cause this gala was supposedly supporting. And that's when something my Aunt Margot had mentioned at Christmas dinner months ago suddenly clicked into place. She'd mentioned something about the family trust, about irregular withdrawals, about needing to review the accounts more carefully. At the time, I'd barely paid attention. Finance stuff was boring, and I trusted that the adults were handling it. But standing there in that hallway, looking at my sister's desperate face, I suddenly wondered if this wasn't about me being an embarrassment at all. What if I was a threat? I pulled out my phone. Hands weren't shaking. Right then, I just felt it in a way I'd never felt before. I scrolled through my contacts until I found that I looked my sister directly in the eyes as I hit the call button. I told her I was calling Aunt Margot. I told her we were going to talk about the charity gala, and about the family trust, and about where exactly all that money had been going. Kendall's face went white. Not pale, white, like every drop of blood had drained from her body. She reached for my phone, tried to grab it from my hand, but I stepped back. And that's when I knew for certain that I'd hit something big. My aunt answered on the third ring. I kept my voice steady as I told her where I was and that she needed to come immediately. I mentioned Kendall's name. I mentioned grandmother's trust fund. I mentioned money. Kendall was whispering frantically that I didn't understand, that I was making a terrible mistake, that I needed to hang up the phone right now. But I didn't hang up. I gave Margot the address and told her to hurry. When I ended the call, Kendall looked at me with something I'd never seen in her eyes before. She told me I just ruined everything. And I realized I had absolutely no idea what everything even meant. The 15 minutes between my phone call and Aunt Margot's arrival felt like hours. Kendall kept trying to pull me aside, to explain, to convince me to call Margot back and tell her it was a misunderstanding. But I refused to move from that hallway. Something primal in me knew that if I let her talk me down, if I let her spin whatever story she was preparing, I'd lose. So I just stood there, arms crossed, watching her panic. She tried everything. First, she told me I was overreacting. Then she said I was jealous of her success and trying to sabotage her event. When that didn't work, she actually started crying. Those perfect, camera-ready tears that didn't mess up her makeup. She begged me to think about our family, about how much this would hurt Mom and Dad. But I kept thinking about Christmas dinner, about Margot's concerned face when she'd mentioned those irregular withdrawals, about how Kendall had suddenly wanted to be close to me again right around that same time. I wasn't overreacting. I was finally paying attention. When Margot walked through the restaurant's main entrance, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made my knees buckle. My aunt is in her late 50s, always impeccably dressed in that old money way that doesn't try too hard. She's been the president of the Hastings Trust Board since our grandmother died 8 years ago. She takes that responsibility seriously, maybe because she watched her own sister, our mother, marry someone who only cared about appearances. Margot took one look at Kendall's tear-stained face and my rigid posture, and I watched her expression harden. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She walked straight past the hostess and into the private event space like she owned it. Which, in a way, she kind of did. The Hastings name still carries weight in certain Manhattan circles. The conversations in the room started to die down as people noticed her. Margot has that effect. She doesn't demand attention, she just commands it naturally. She said my name, loud enough for people nearby to hear. She said I'd called her with concerns about Kendall's charitable work. Then she said something that made the entire room go silent. She said the quarterly trust report showed unauthorized withdrawals, and she wanted to discuss them publicly since this was apparently a charitable event. Kendall tried to laugh it off. She said it was a family matter, that we should discuss it privately, that this wasn't the time or place. Her voice had that high, brittle quality of someone desperately trying to maintain control. But Margot wasn't interested in maintaining anything except that she pulled out her phone. She'd come prepared, I realized, and started reading numbers. $280,000 withdrawn over 6 months, all of it labeled as charitable expenses. All of it supposedly going to various nonprofit organizations, except Margot's lawyers had checked. There were no donation records, no receipts, no paper trail showing where that money had actually gone. The room was dead silent now. Every single person. I could see Kendall's friends exchanging glances, their perfect faces registering shock and confusion. Some of them were slowly backing away, like they didn't want to be associated with whatever was about to happen. Margot wasn't done. She said she'd spent the last month investigating after the trust's accountant flagged irregularities, and what she'd found was worse than just unauthorized withdrawals. This charity gala we were standing in, it wasn't registered with any legitimate charitable organization. Kendall had been selling tickets for $5,000 each, promising the money would go to underprivileged children's education. But there was no foundation, no nonprofit status, no charitable designation at all. It was just Kendall, selling expensive tickets to wealthy people and pocketing every cent. I felt my stomach drop. $5,000 per person. I looked around the room and counted roughly 60 guests. That was $300,000, just from this one event. And suddenly, so many things made sense. The designer clothes, the luxury vacations Kendall posted on Instagram, the penthouse apartment in Tribeca, Dylan's successful business that somehow never seemed to require him to actually work. It was all fake. All of it built on stolen money. Money that should have been mine too. When our grandmother died, she'd left her entire estate, nearly $40 million, in a trust meant to be divided equally between Kendall and me when we each turned 35. Until then, we each got a modest monthly allowance, and any major expenses had to be approved by the trust board. I'd never questioned it. I'd been grateful for the monthly stipend that helped with my rent and student loans. I'd assumed Kendall was living off the same amount, plus whatever she made from her influencer work and Dylan's business. But she hadn't been living off her allowance at all. She'd been stealing from the principal, from my inheritance. Margot's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. She was addressing the room now, telling the guests that this wasn't a legitimate charity event, that they should demand refunds immediately, that if they'd written checks, they should stop payment before they cleared. The chaos that erupted was immediate, people shouting, demanding explanations. Some of them were already on their phones, presumably calling their banks or their lawyers. A few of the society women Kendall had been posing with earlier were staring at her with undisguised disgust. I saw Dylan push through the crowd from the bar area. He'd clearly been drinking. His face was flushed. His expensive suit jacket was unbuttoned. When he reached Kendall, he didn't comfort her or defend her. He asked her if it was true. She couldn't even look at him. She just stood there, shaking, tears now running freely down her face and finally ruining her makeup. Dylan turned and looked at me. His eyes were wild, desperate. He asked me if I'd known about this, if I'd been in on it. And that's when I said something I'd been wanting to say for years without even knowing it. I asked him if he knew his precious business had been bankrupt for 2 years, if he knew his wife had been funding their entire lifestyle with stolen money. Money that was supposed to be mine. The look on his face told me he hadn't known. Not all of it, anyway. Margot touched my shoulder. She said we needed to go, that her lawyers would handle everything from here. She'd already called the police to report the fraud. She'd already frozen all of Kendall's accounts and access to the trust. As we walked out of that restaurant, I could hear Kendall screaming. Not words exactly, just this raw, desperate sound of someone watching their entire world collapse. I should have felt sorry for her. She was my sister. But all I felt was this cold, hard certainty that I'd done exactly the right thing, and I realized that this was just the beginning. If Kendall had stolen $280,000 and she was about to make another $300,000 from this fake gala, how much had she taken before I'd started paying attention? How long had she been robbing me blind while I worked 60-hour weeks and worried about making rent? The answer to that question would turn out to be even worse than I imagined. The next morning, I woke up to 73 text messages and 42 missed calls. Most of them were from Kendall. Some were from our parents. A few were from Dylan, and one, the one that made my blood pressure spike, was from our mother, telling me I needed to come to the house immediately for a family meeting. I knew what that meant. It meant Kendall had already spun her version of events. It meant I was about to be painted as the villain who'd humiliated her sister in public and destroyed her charity work over a simple misunderstanding. I almost didn't go. I sat on my couch in my tiny Brooklyn apartment, drinking coffee and staring at my phone, seriously considering just blocking all their numbers and moving on with my life. But Aunt Margot called. She told me I needed to face them, that running away would only make me look guilty, like I'd done something wrong. She reminded me that I hadn't done anything except tell the truth. So I went. My parents live in Westchester, in the same house where Kendall and I grew up. It's a beautiful colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn and a driveway that always has at least one luxury car parked in it. Usually my father's Mercedes or whatever sports car he's leasing that year. My dad's a corporate lawyer. My mom doesn't work, unless you count her position on various charity boards as work. Appearances matter to them. They always have. When I pulled up, I saw Kendall's Range Rover already there. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to get out of my car and walk to the front door. My mother answered before I could even knock. Her face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't hug me. She just stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. Kendall was sitting on the couch, looking absolutely devastated. Her eyes were red and swollen, real crying this time, not the pretty tears from yesterday. Dylan sat next to her, but there was space between them. His jaw was clenched, and he wouldn't look at anyone. My father stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, looking like he was about to deliver a closing argument. I sat in the armchair across from them and waited. My mother started. She said she couldn't believe I would do something so cruel, so public, so devastating to my own sister. She said Kendall had made mistakes, yes, but that families handle things privately, that what I'd done was unforgivable. I didn't respond. I just let her talk. Then my father jumped in. He said that Kendall had already spoken to their lawyers, that there were explanations for everything, that the trust withdrawals were legitimate business expenses that had simply been miscategorized. He said, if I'd just come to them privately instead of causing a scene, this all could have been cleared up quietly. I watched Kendall while he talked. She was staring at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her. She looked small and broken. Nothing like the confident influencer who'd tried to kick me out of her event yesterday. That's when I realized something crucial. My parents genuinely believed her. Or at least, they wanted to believe her badly enough that they'd accepted whatever story she'd told them without question, which meant Kendall thought she could still control the narrative. She thought if she played the victim well enough, she could make this all go away. I made a decision in that moment. I was going to play along, not because I believed her or forgave her, but because I wanted to know exactly how deep this went. I wanted to hear her explanation. I wanted to understand the full scope of what she'd done before the lawyers and the courts got involved. So I did something that surprised everyone in the room. I apologized. I said I'd overreacted, that I'd been hurt by what happened at the restaurant and had made a rash decision to call Margot. Maybe I should have come to Kendall privately first. The relief on my parents' faces was immediate. My mother actually teared up. My father nodded approvingly, like I'd finally shown some maturity. Kendall looked up at me, and for just a second, I saw calculation in her eyes. She was trying to figure out if I was serious or if this was a trap. But she needed me to back down. She needed this to go away. So she took the lifeline I was offering. She said she understood why I'd been upset, that she'd handled the situation at the restaurant poorly, that she'd been stressed about the event and had taken it out on me. She said the trust withdrawals were for legitimate business investments that would eventually benefit both of us. She said the charity event was properly registered, that Margot's information must have been outdated or incomplete. She was lying. I knew it. Margot knew it. Hell, even Dylan looked skeptical, but my parents wanted to believe her, so they did. My mother suggested we all have lunch together, that we needed to heal as a family. My father said he'd call Margot and straighten everything out with the trust. I agreed to lunch. I smiled. I hugged Kendall when my mother insisted. While I was hugging her, while my parents were beaming with family drama was resolved, Kendall whispered something in my ear that she probably immediately regretted. She said thank you for backing down, that she knew I'd made the smart choice. Then she said something else, so quietly I almost missed it. She said that if I'd kept pushing, I would have been embarrassed when the truth came out. because Dylan's new business venture was about to make them legitimate millionaires, and I'd have looked like the jealous sister who couldn't handle her success. My blood went cold, but I kept smiling. I pulled back from the hug and told her I was happy for her. That I couldn't wait to hear more about Dylan's business. She relaxed completely then. She actually smiled, a real smile, full of relief and something that looked like triumph. She thought she'd won. She thought I'd folded, but what she didn't know was that she'd just told me exactly what I needed to investigate next. Because if Dylan had a new business venture, and if Kendall believed it was going to make them millionaires, then the money she'd stolen wasn't just for maintaining their lifestyle. It was an investment in something big enough that she was willing to risk, including her relationship with her family, to fund it. We had lunch at some expensive restaurant in White Plains. We made small talk. We posed for a family photo that my mother immediately posted on Facebook with a caption about the importance of forgiveness and family bonds. I played my part perfectly. The reformed sister, the one who'd learned her lesson about airing family business in public. But while we ate overpriced salads and my parents went on about their upcoming trip to Martha's Vineyard, I was texting Margot under the table. I told her not to back down, not to let my father convince her to drop the investigation. I told her that Kendall had slipped up, that there was something bigger happening, and that we needed to find out what it was before they had time to cover their tracks. Margot's response, she told me she'd already anticipated my parents would pressure. She said her lawyers were moving forward regardless, and that they'd uncovered something interesting in Dylan's business records that I needed to see. When lunch ended and we said our goodbyes, Kendall hugged me again. She told me she loved me, that she was glad we'd worked things out. I told her I loved her too, and I realized that lying to her face felt surprisingly, maybe because she'd been doing it to me for so long that I'd learned from the best. She thought she'd manipulated me into backing down, but really I'd just gotten exactly what I needed. Her guard was down, and she'd given me a clue about where to look next. Dylan's business, whatever it was the key to understanding everything. And I was going to find out exactly what my sister had done with my money. 3 days after that family lunch, I met Aunt Margot at her attorney's office in Midtown. The building was one of those intimidating glass towers where every person in the lobby looks like they bill by the minute, and even the security guards wear designer suits. Margot was waiting for me in a conference room on the 42nd floor. Spread across the massive mahogany table were stacks of documents, financial statements, and what looked like printed screenshots of text messages and emails. Her lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, gestured for me to sit down. She didn't waste time with small talk. She told me they'd been digging into Dylan's business activities, and what they'd found was worse than simple theft. It was a systematic, multi-year fraud scheme that had been carefully constructed to look legitimate on the surface. Patricia slid a folder across the table to me. Inside were incorporation documents for something called Ashford Capital Solutions. Dylan was listed as CEO and founder. The company claimed to be a private equity firm specializing in emerging technology investments. On paper, it looked impressive. Professional website, LinkedIn profiles for supposed team members, even a few press releases about successful investments. But it was all fake. Patricia showed me the evidence. The team members were stock photos purchased from websites. The press releases were published on pay-to-play news sites that would print anything for a few $100s. The office address listed on the incorporation documents was a virtual mail forwarding service. Ashford Capital Solutions didn't actually do anything except exist on paper, but it had bank accounts that had received over $600,000 in the past 18 months, all of it transferred from the Hastings Trust through Kendall's fraudulent withdrawals. My hands started shaking as I looked through the bank statements. $600,000. Not the $280,000 that Margot had mentioned at the restaurant. That had only been the most recent 6 months. This had been going on for a year and a half. Patricia explained the scheme. Kendall would submit withdrawal requests to the trust, claiming the money was needed for various approved expenses: medical procedures, home renovations, charitable donations, business investments. The trust board would approve them because they seemed legitimate and because nobody suspected that one of the beneficiaries would systematically rob her own inheritance. The money would go into Kendall's personal account first and then get transferred to Ashford Capital Solutions, usually in smaller chunks to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. From there, Dylan would use it however he wanted. And based on the records Patricia had subpoenaed, however he wanted meant keeping up the appearance of being a successful businessman while his actual career was circling the drain. Margot spoke up then. She said they'd also looked into Dylan's employment history. Turned out he'd been fired from his position at a hedge fund 3 years ago. Not laid off, not restructured out, but fired for poor performance and suspected misappropriation of client funds. Nothing had been proven, so there were no criminal charges, but his reputation in the finance world was destroyed. That's when he'd started Ashford Capital Solutions, a fake company to explain where his money was coming from, because he couldn't admit to his society friends and his influencer wife that he was actually broke and unemployable. But here's the part that made me feel physically sick. Patricia pulled out another document. This one was a loan application that Dylan had submitted to a private lender 6 months ago. He'd been trying to borrow $2 million, using the Hastings Trust as collateral. He'd claimed that as Kendall's husband, he had a legal right to a portion of her trust inheritance, and that he wanted to borrow against his future payout. The loan had been denied because the lender did their due diligence and discovered that the trust was ironclad. There was no way Dylan could access it unless Kendall divorced him and got a settlement, or unless something happened to both Kendall and me, and he somehow inherited through her. But the fact that he'd tried meant something important. It meant he'd been getting desperate. It meant $600,000 hadn't been enough. He wanted more. Much more. And that's when I understood Kendall's real motivation for everything that had happened. She hadn't been stealing from the trust in a lifestyle. She'd been stealing to keep Dylan happy, to keep him from leaving her. Because Dylan had married her, thinking she was rich, thinking he'd have access to family money, and when he realized he couldn't touch the trust until she turned 35, he'd started pressuring her to find other ways to get the money. Margot confirmed my suspicion. She said they'd found text Kendall and Dylan, messages that Patricia's team had obtained through a court order as part of the fraud investigation. In those messages, Dylan wasn't the supportive husband he pretended to be in public. He was manipulative, demanding, sometimes even threatening. He told Kendall that if she couldn't find a way to fund his business, he'd leave her and tell everyone that she was broke, that her influencer lifestyle was fake, that she was nothing without her family's money. He'd called her worthless, stupid, a disappointment. And Kendall, so desperate to keep up the appearance of a perfect marriage to her perfect husband, had committed fraud rather than admit the truth. I felt a twisted kind of pity looking at those messages. My sister, the confident, beautiful, successful woman that everyone admired, had been controlled and manipulated by a failed finance bro who couldn't accept his own mediocrity. But then, Patricia showed me something else that killed any sympathy I might have had. There were messages between Kendall and a lawyer, messages about changing the trust structure, about whether there was any way to legally exclude me from my half of the inheritance. Kendall had been researching whether she could cut me out entirely. She'd asked about challenging grandmother's will, about proving that I was somehow unfit to receive the money, about whether my unstable career and lack of family commitment could be used as grounds to revoke my beneficiary status. The lawyer had told her it was impossible. The trust was airtight. Our grandmother had been very specific that both of us would receive equal shares no matter what, but Kendall had tried. She'd actively tried to steal my entire inheritance, not just skim from it. And when that didn't work, she'd done the next best thing. She'd stolen as much as she could before I noticed, and she'd tried to make sure I'd never be welcome in her world enough to ask questions about where the money was going. That's why she'd invited me to the gala, not to reconnect, not because she wanted me there, but because she'd known Margot was getting suspicious, and she'd needed to control the narrative. She'd planned to publicly reject me, to establish that we weren't close, so that if I ever came forward with concerns about the trust, people would think it was just a bitter sister trying to cause trouble. She'd invited me specifically so she could humiliate me and make me look unstable in front of witnesses. I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything. My sister hadn't just stolen from me, she'd plotted to destroy my credibility, to isolate me from the family, to make sure that even if the truth came out, nobody would believe me. Patricia asked if I was okay. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. Margot reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said we had enough evidence now, enough to press criminal charges, to recover all the stolen money plus damages, to make sure Kendall and Dylan faced real consequences. But she said I needed to decide how far I wanted to take this. Because once we filed the criminal there would be no going back. I have to choose sides. The media would probably pick up the story. Kendall's entire life, I thought about those, about Dylan calling my sister worthless, about Kendall trying to cut me out of my own inheritance, about every fake smile and manufactured family moment that had been designed to keep me compliant and ignorant. I told Patricia to file everything. Criminal charges for fraud, civil suit for recovery of funds and damages. I wanted every penny back, and I wanted them both to face the legal consequences of what they'd done. Margot nodded approvingly. She said her lawyers would handle everything, but that I should prepare myself. Things were about to get very ugly, very publicly. As I left that office building and stepped out into the Manhattan after, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Kendall. She said she missed me and wanted to plan another family dinner soon. She said she was so glad we'd worked things out, and that she'd been thinking about how important it was to appreciate the people you love. She had no idea what was coming, and I realized something that maybe made me a little bit like her after all. I was getting very good at pretending everything was fine while planning someone's destruction behind their back. The difference was, I was doing it to protect myself from a thief. She'd done it just to feed her husband's ego and maintain an Instagram-perfect lie. Patricia filed the criminal complaint exactly 1 week later, on a Wednesday morning. I know the exact day because that's when my entire family's world exploded. The police showed up at Kendall and Dylan's Tribeca penthouse at 7 a.m. with a warrant. By 8:30, both of them were being questioned at the precinct. By noon, the story had leaked to the press. Not from me or Margot, but from someone at the police department who must have recognized Kendall's name and her Instagram following. By 3 p.m., it was trending on Twitter. My parents called me 17 times that day. I didn't answer. I knew what they'd say. That I was destroying the family, that I should have handled this privately, that I was being vindictive and cruel. They'd want me to drop the charges, all go away, to prioritize family over, but I wasn't going to do that this time. What I didn't expect was the phone call I got that evening from someone who would end up being the ally I didn't know I knew. Her name was Rachel Kim, and she was Dylan's ex-girlfriend from college. She'd seen the news story. She'd seen Dylan's name and Kendall's face plastered across social media with headlines about fraud and stolen inheritance, and she'd decided to reach out to me through my LinkedIn profile because she said she had information I needed to hear. We met the next day at a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from anywhere my family might accidentally run into us. Rachel was around my age, dressed in business casual with the kind of understated confidence that comes from actually being successful rather than just pretending to be. She didn't waste time. She told me she'd dated Dylan for 3 years in college and another 2 years after graduation. She'd been planning to marry him, and then she discovered that he'd been systematically stealing from her. Small amounts at first. He'd borrow money for rent and never pay it back. He'd use her credit cards for emergencies that never seemed to be real emergencies. He'd convinced her to invest in his business ideas that always failed and somehow left him with her money. By the time she'd figured out what was happening, he'd taken almost $70,000 from her, including the money she'd saved for a down payment on a house. When she'd confronted him, he'd turned it around on her. He'd told her she was being paranoid and controlling. He'd said a real partner would support his dreams. He'd made her feel guilty for even asking about the money. She'd eventually broken up with him and taken him to small claims court. She'd won, but he'd never paid the judgment. He'd declared bankruptcy and walked away, leaving her with nothing but a legal victory that meant nothing in practical terms. Rachel said she'd followed his life from a distance after that, watching him reinvent himself on social media as a successful businessman, watching him marry Kendall, this beautiful influencer with family. She'd figured he'd finally found what he was looking for, someone wealthy enough that he'd never have to actually work or be accountable. But seeing the news about the fraud charges didn't surprise her at all. She said Dylan had a pattern. He targeted women with money or access to money. He made them fall in love with the idea of who he pretended to be, and then he drained them dry while making them feel like they were the problem. What Rachel wanted to offer me was something Patricia's team hadn't been able to get: character evidence. She had documentation of Dylan's previous fraud, court records, text messages, emails where he'd admitted to taking her money and justified it as borrowing from someone who owed him support. She also had something else. She had the names and contact information of 3 other women Dylan had done this to. Women who'd never pressed charges because he'd made them feel ashamed or crazy for even suggesting he'd stolen from them. Rachel had stayed in touch with them over the years through a private Facebook group she'd created called Dylan Ashford's Recovery Support. Yes, Ashford was actually his middle name. He'd used it to rebrand himself as Dylan Ashford in business circles, probably hoping his past victims wouldn't be able to find him as easily. These women were willing to testify. They were willing to provide evidence. They were willing to show a pattern of behavior that would prove Dylan was a serial con artist, not just someone who'd made poor decisions in his marriage. I asked Rachel why she was putting herself back into Dylan's orbit after finally getting away from him. She looked at me with this fierce, determined expression. She said, because women like us deserve to see men like him actually face consequences for once. She said she'd spent years feeling stupid and ashamed for falling for his manipulation, and watching him live this glamorous life on social media while she was still recovering financially had been like reopening the wound over and over. This was her chance to stop him from doing it to anyone else, to stop him from moving on to the next victim after Kendall. Because Rachel had no doubt that even if Kendall somehow stayed with him through this, he'd eventually find another source of money to exploit. I took all of Rachel's evidence straight to Patricia, and Patricia's eyes lit up like she'd just won the lottery. She explained that proving a pattern of fraud would change everything. Instead of this being a one-time mistake, a marital dispute about money management, or even just a case of Kendall acting alone, this would show that Dylan was the architect, that he'd done this before, that Kendall was actually another one of his victims, even though she'd committed crimes in service of his manipulation. Patricia said this evidence could potentially result in federal charges, not just state charges. Wire fraud. Racketeering if they could prove he'd made a business out of defrauding women. Serious prison time instead of just fines and probation. Over the next week, Patricia's team interviewed all 3 of Dylan's other victims. Their stories were horrifyingly similar to Rachel's. All successful women with good careers. All of them had fallen for Dylan's charm and his convincing story about being on the verge of major business success. All of them had loaned or invested money that they never saw again. One of them, a woman named Jennifer, had lost over $100,000, her entire inheritance from her father. Dylan had convinced her to invest it in Ashford Capital Solutions back when it first started. He'd shown her fake prospectuses and fabricated returns. By the time she realized it was all fake, he'd already moved on to Kendall, and Jennifer had been too embarrassed to report. Evidence was overwhelming, and it fundamentally changed the case. The prosecutor's office upgraded the charges. Dylan was now facing multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, he'd forged signatures on some of the trust documents, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Kendall was facing lesser charges because the evidence suggested she'd been manipulated, but she was still an active participant who'd signed documents she knew were fraudulent. Margot told me that the prosecutor had offered Kendall a deal. If she testified against Dylan and provided evidence of his role in planning the fraud, they'd recommend probation instead of prison time. She'd still have to pay back everything, but she wouldn't go to jail. I asked if Kendall had taken the deal. Margot said she hadn't decided yet. She was still clinging to Dylan, still believing his version of events where he was the victim and everyone else was lying. Her lawyer was apparently begging her to take the deal, but she kept insisting that Dylan loved her, that this was all a misunderstanding, that he'd never intentionally hurt her. I recognized that kind of denial. I'd seen it in the text messages between them. Dylan had spent years breaking down Kendall's sense of reality until she couldn't tell the difference between his lies and the truth. Part of me wanted her to wake up and see him for what he was. Part of me wanted her to take responsibility for what she'd done to me, regardless of why she'd done it. But mostly, I just felt tired of family drama. Tired of watching my sister destroy herself over a man who saw her as nothing but a source of funding. Rachel texted me that night. She said she'd heard about the upgraded charges and wanted to know how I was holding up. She said watching Dylan finally face consequences felt surreal after so many years of knowing he'd gotten away with it. We ended up talking on the phone for 2 hours. She told me more about her experience with Dylan, about the therapy she'd needed to recover from the gaslight, about how she'd rebuilt her life and her ability to trust people. And she said something that stuck with me. She said the hardest part wasn't losing the money. It was losing the version of herself who'd believed she was smart enough not to fall for something like that. I understood exactly, because even though Kendall was the one who'd stolen, I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, for not questioning why my success, for believing that family meant something. Someone who understood the specific kind of betrayal that comes from financial abuse by people you trusted. We started meeting for coffee regularly. She introduced me to the other women from the support group. We talked about recovery, about boundaries, about how to trust again without being. And I realized that even though Kendall had taken money from me, she'd accidentally given me something valuable. A network of women who understood, who'd survived similar betrayals, who were moving forward instead of staying stuck in shame. Patricia called me a few days later with news. The prosecutor had set a deadline for Kendall's plea deal. She had 72 hours to decide if she was going to testify against Dylan or face the full consequences alongside him. I didn't know what she'd choose. Part of me hoped she'd finally see the truth. Part of me didn't care anymore. What I did know was that I had everything I needed now: evidence, allies, legal representation, and most importantly, absolute clarity about who I was dealing with. The game was no longer about defense or even just recovery. It was about making sure that what happened to Rachel and Jennifer and those other women never happened to anyone else. It was about stopping Dylan permanently, and it was about showing Kendall that there were consequences for betraying the people who loved you, even if you'd been manipulated into doing it. Kendall took the plea deal with 11 hours left on the deadline. I found out through Margot, who called me from Patricia's office where they'd just received confirmation from the prosecutor. Kendall had finally agreed to testify against Dylan in exchange for probation and a structured repayment plan for the stolen funds. Her lawyer had apparently convinced her by showing her the evidence from Rachel and the other victims. When Kendall realized that Dylan had done this exact same thing to multiple women before her, that she wasn't special, wasn't different, wasn't the love of his life, but just another mark, something inside her finally broke. She'd filed for divorce the same day she took the plea deal. I should have felt vindicated, relieved, something positive. But mostly I just felt hollow. My sister had destroyed her life, her reputation, and our family, for a man who'd never actually loved her. Even though she'd stolen, even though she'd tried to cut me out of my... There was still this small that remembered when we were kids, and she'd let me borrow her. That version, like or maybe she'd always been a stranger, and I'd just been too naive to see it. But I didn't have much time to process those feelings, because Patricia called me in for an emergency meeting 2 days later. She had information that changed everything. Again, Dylan's lawyer had reached out asking for a meeting, not to negotiate a plea deal, something else. When we arrived at Patricia's office, Dylan's attorney was already there, a slick-looking man in his 50s named Marcus Webb who probably charged $1,000 an hour. Dylan wasn't with him, which Patricia had insisted on as a condition of the meeting. Marcus got straight to the point. His client was willing to provide information about other criminal activity in exchange for a reduced sentence, information that would be of significant interest to federal prosecutors. Patricia's expression didn't change, but I could feel the tension in the room shift. She asked what kind of information. Marcus said that Ashford Capital Solutions hadn't just been a front for defrauding the Hastings Trust. Dylan had also been using it to launder money for several wealthy clients who needed to hide income from the IRS. He had documentation, bank records, names, transaction histories. He'd essentially been running a white-collar criminal operation, and now he wanted to trade that information for leniency. Patricia asked why Dylan thought this information would be valuable enough to significantly reduce his sentence, given the severity of the fraud charges against him. Marcus slid a document across the table. It was a list of names, about 15 of them. I didn't recognize most of them, but a few stood out. A city councilman, a real estate developer who'd been in the news for questionable dealings, and one name that made my blood run cold. My father's name, Robert Cole. Patricia saw me staring at the list. She asked Marcus to clarify what he was implying about that particular name. Marcus said that Robert Cole had been using Ashford Capital Solutions to hide consulting fees he'd been receiving from a client whose case he was supposed to be handling impartially as opposing counsel. It was a conflict of interest that could get him disbarred and potentially charged with fraud himself. The room started spinning. My father, my self-righteous, law and order, always lecturing about ethics father, had been using Dylan's fake company to commit financial crimes. And suddenly, so many things made sense. Why my father had been so quick to defend Kendall when this all started. Why he'd pressured Margot to drop the investigation. Why he'd insisted we handle everything privately, within the family. It wasn't about protecting Kendall's reputation. It was about protecting himself. If Dylan went down and the full scope of Ashford Capital Solutions was exposed, my father would go down too. His law career would be over. He might even face prison time. Patricia asked how long my father had been using Dylan's services. Marcus said about 14 months. Long enough that the IRS would be very interested in those unreported fees, which totaled somewhere around $300,000. I felt sick. My father had known what Dylan was. He'd known Dylan was a fraud. And instead of warning Kendall or trying to protect her, he'd just used Dylan's criminal operation for his own benefit. Patricia told Marcus we'd need time to review this information and consult with the prosecutors. Marcus said they understood, but that Dylan's offer had a time limit. 1 week? After that, he'd take his chances at trial and the information would stay buried. After Marcus left, I sat in Patricia's conference room staring at that list of names. Patricia and Margot were discussing legal strategy, talking about whether this information would actually help Dylan's case or hurt it. But I couldn't focus on any of it. My father was a criminal, not just ethically compromised, an actual criminal who'd been actively breaking the law while lecturing me about family loyalty and handling things the right way. Margot eventually noticed I'd gone silent. She asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I asked her if she'd known, if she'd suspected that my father was involved in Dylan's schemes. She said she hadn't known about the specifics, but that she'd always found it suspicious how quickly my father had jumped to defend Dylan when the initial allegations came out. She'd wondered if there was more to the relationship than just a son-in-law connection. I asked what would happen now, if the prosecutors would go after my father too. Patricia said it depended on whether they thought Dylan's information was credible and valuable enough to grant him a deal. But yes, if they pursued it, my father would likely face investigation and potentially charges. And I had to decide whether I wanted that to happen. Because Patricia said I had leverage here. As the primary victim in the case, my opinion carried weight with the prosecutors. If I said I wanted them to take Dylan's deal and investigate everyone on that list, they'd probably do it. If I said I wanted them to reject the deal and just focus on punishing Dylan for what he did to me and Kendall, they'd probably do that instead. Margot said quietly that my father would probably come to me. That once he found out Dylan was offering to cooperate, he'd try to convince me to tell the prosecutors to reject the deal. He'd probably use family guilt, maybe even threats about what would happen to my mother if he lost his career and his freedom. She was right. He called me that same evening. I didn't answer, but he left a voicemail, and against my better judgment, I listened to it. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not angry or authoritative. Desperate, almost panicked. He said he'd heard about Dylan's potential cooperation deal. He said we needed to talk immediately, that there were things I didn't understand about the situation. He said that if I let the prosecutors pursue everyone Dylan named, I'd be destroying our entire family. Not just Kendall, but him, my mother, everyone. He said I had a choice to make about what kind of person I wanted, whether I wanted to be someone who tore families apart or someone who understood forgiveness and discretion. I listened to that voicemail 3 times, and each time I heard what he wasn't saying. He wasn't apologizing for using a criminal operation to hide illegal income. He wasn't acknowledging that he'd been complicit in enabling Dylan while his own daughter was being manipulated and used. He wasn't expressing any concern about what Kendall had been through or what I'd been through. He was just worried about himself, about his reputation, about the consequences of his own choices finally catching up with him. I called Patricia back. I told her I wanted to meet with the prosecutors directly. I wanted to understand exactly what was on that list, what crimes had been committed, and what justice would actually look like. She said she'd arrange it for the next day. That night, I sat in my apartment thinking about the moment at the restaurant when Kendall had told me I didn't belong in her world, when she'd looked at me like I was an embarrassment she needed to get rid of. And I realized she'd been right, just not in the way she meant. I didn't belong in a world where appearances mattered more than truth, where family loyalty meant protecting criminals instead of victims, where success was measured by how well you could maintain a beautiful lie. I'd never wanted to belong in that world anyway. The meeting with the prosecutors was set for 2 p.m. the next day. By then, Dylan's lawyer would need an answer. Was the deal on or off? Would Dylan get to trade his information for a lighter sentence, or would he face the full weight of his crimes alone? And more importantly for my father, would I choose to protect him by rejecting the deal, or would I choose to expose everything regardless of who got hurt? I knew my decision would define me, not just to my family, but to myself. It would show me whether I was still the woman who tried to keep everyone happy and avoid making waves, or whether I'd finally become someone who demanded real accountability. The woman who'd walked into that restaurant in her Macy's dress wouldn't have known what to do. She would have been paralyzed by guilt and family obligation. But I wasn't that woman anymore. And I was done protecting people who'd never protected. The prosecutor's office was in Lower Manhattan, in one of those government buildings that looks exactly like what you'd imagine. Fluorescent lights, beige walls, and the faint smell of burnt coffee that never quite goes away. Patricia and I sat across from Assistant U.S. Attorney James Richardson, a man in his early 40s with tired eyes and a file folder thick enough to be a weapon. Margot had offered to come, but I'd asked her not to. This needed to be my decision, made without anyone else's influence. Richardson didn't sugarcoat anything. He laid out exactly what Dylan's cooperation would mean. Dylan had been meticulous in his record-keeping, probably because he'd always planned to use it as leverage if he ever got caught. He had documentation of every transaction, every client, every dollar that had moved through Ashford Capital Solutions. If the prosecutors pursued it, they could build cases against at least 12 of the 15 people on that list. My father was one of them, and his case was particularly strong because Dylan had emails where my father explicitly acknowledged that the money needed to be handled discreetly and kept off the books. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. My father had knowingly committed tax fraud and violated legal ethics rules that would absolutely result in disbarment if proven. Richardson said that if I gave my support for Dylan's cooperation deal, they'd recommend a reduced sentence, probably 7 to 10 years instead of 15 to 20. Dylan would testify against everyone on that list, and the prosecutors would go after all of them, including my father. If I opposed the deal, they'd reject Dylan's offer and focus solely on prosecuting him for the fraud against the Hastings Trust. My father would likely never be investigated, at least not as part of this case. Richardson watched me carefully as he explained this. He said he needed to be honest with this wasn't really about Dylan anymore. Dylan was going to prison either way. This was about whether I wanted to expose a network of white-collar criminals who'd been using his operation to break the law, or whether I wanted to limit the damage to just the people who directly hurt me. He said there was no right answer, that both choices were valid, that I shouldn't feel pressured to pursue charges against my own father just because it was the right thing to do legally. But then he said something that changed my perspective entirely. He said one of the other names on Dylan's list was a real estate developer named Marcus Chen, who'd been under investigation for bribing city officials. The prosecutors had never been able to prove it because they couldn't trace the money, but Dylan's records showed exactly how the bribes had been paid, through Ashford Capital Solutions, disguised as consulting fees and investment returns. If Dylan cooperated, they could finally build a case against Chen. And that mattered because Chen's development projects had displaced hundreds of low-income families, often through questionable means. He'd demolished affordable housing to build luxury condos, and there had always been whispers that he'd bribed his way through the permitting process. Richardson said taking down Chen could prevent future harm to vulnerable people. It could expose corruption that went far beyond just financial crimes. And suddenly, this wasn't just about punishing my father. It was about whether I was willing to let multiple criminals walk free just to protect one of them who happened to be related to me. I asked Richardson for 24 hours to think about it. He said I had 12. Dylan's lawyer had moved up the deadline. Apparently, Dylan was getting nervous about the prosecution building their case and wanted to make the deal happen quickly. Patricia and I left the prosecutor's office and walked to a nearby park. It was one of those crisp October afternoons where the leaves were just starting to turn and the city felt almost peaceful despite the chaos of traffic and tourists. I sat on a bench and tried to think clearly. Patricia sat next to me but didn't say anything. She just waited. My phone rang. It was my mother this time. I let it go to voicemail, but I could see she'd already called 6 times that day. My father had clearly told her what was happening, and now they were both panicking. The voicemail notification popped up. I played it. My mother was crying. She said I needed to come home right away, that my father was a mess, that I needed to understand what I was doing to the family. She said my father had made a mistake. Yes, but that he was still my father and I owed him loyalty. She said that if I let the prosecutors go after him, she'd never forgive me, that I'd be choosing strangers over my own, that I'd be destroying everything our family had built. And then she said something that made my decision crystal clear. She said, "After everything we've done for you, after the life we've given you, this is how you repay us? By being vindictive and cruel just like you were to your sister?" Just like I was to Kendall, my mother genuinely believed that exposing Kendall's fraud had been an act of cruelty rather than self-defense. She genuinely believed that I owed my parents unconditional protection, even when they'd committed crimes. She genuinely believed that family meant covering up for each other, no matter what. In that, I understood something I should have seen years ago. My family's version of love was conditional. It was transactional. It only existed when I played my assigned role. The quiet one, the forgiving one, the one who didn't cause trouble or ask difficult questions. The moment I'd stepped outside that role by exposing Kendall, I'd become the villain in their story. Now that I had the power to expose my father too, I was being framed as vindictive rather than someone seeking justice. I looked at Patricia. I told her I'd made my decision. I called Richardson directly. I told him to accept Dylan's cooperation deal. I told him to pursue every single person on that list, including my father. I told him I'd provide a victim impact statement and testify if needed. Richardson said he'd move forward immediately. The deal would be finalized within 24 hours, and the investigations would begin right after. Patricia asked if I was sure, if I understood that this would permanently destroy my relationship with my parents. I said I understood, and I said something I'd never said out loud before, that maybe that relationship was already destroyed, and I'd just been too afraid to admit it. The news broke 3 days later. The U.S. Attorney's Office announced a major white-collar crime investigation into a money laundering scheme that had involved multiple prominent individuals. They didn't name names yet, but it was only a matter of time. My father's law firm put him on immediate administrative leave the same day. Someone had clearly tipped them off that he was part of the investigation. My mother called me screaming, literally screaming. She said I'd destroyed my father's life, that I was a monster, that I was no longer her daughter. She said I'd better hope I never needed anything from them again because they were done with. I hung up and blocked both of their numbers. Kendall sent me a text later that day, 3 words. I understand now. I didn't respond, but I saved the message. Rachel called to check on me. She'd seen the news and correctly guessed that I'd been the one to push for the broader investigation. She asked how I was holding up. I told her honestly, I felt lighter than I had in years. Like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there. And now it was finally gone. She said she understood that cutting off toxic family was always harder than cutting off toxic partners or friends because we're raised to believe that family is supposed to be forever, no matter what. But she said sometimes forever is just too high a price to pay for people who only love you conditionally. The investigations moved quickly after that. Federal prosecutors are thorough when they want to be, and Dylan had given them a roadmap to follow. Within a month, indictments were handed down for 9 of the 15 people on the list. My father was one of them. 3 counts of tax fraud, 2 counts of ethics violations, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit financial crimes. His trial was set for 6 months out. His lawyer was already trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutors weren't. They had solid evidence, and they wanted to make an example. Marcus Chen, the real estate developer, was also indicted. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that he tried to flee the country. He was arrested at JFK trying to board a flight to Hong Kong. Watching that arrest on the news felt surreal. I'd made a choice that had led to that, a choice that had potentially protected hundreds of future victims of Chen's corruption. And yes, that same choice had destroyed my father's career, would probably send him. Both things were true at the same time. Kendall's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following. Because she'd cooperated and testified against Dylan, the judge was expected to go easy on her. Probation, community service, and full restitution of the stolen funds over a 10-year payment plan. Dylan's sentencing would come later, after all the other trials concluded and he'd finished testifying. But his lawyer had managed to get his recommended sentence down to 8 years, which meant he'd probably serve 5 with good behavior. 5 years for destroying multiple women's lives and running a criminal enterprise. It didn't feel like enough, but Rachel reminded me that 5 years was better than nothing. And more importantly, he'd been exposed. His ability to charm and manipulate his way into women's lives was gone. Everyone knew what he was now. That night, sitting in my apartment with takeout from my favorite Thai place, I finally let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The grief of losing my family, the anger at what they'd done, the strange, complicated relief of finally who'd never really seen. And underneath all of that, something I hadn't expected. Pride. I'd stood up for myself. I'd demanded accountability, even when it cost everything. I'd chosen truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty. The woman who'd walked into that restaurant in Le Bernardin wouldn't have been capable of that. She would have backed down. She would have accepted the role of the quiet, forgive sister who didn't make waves. But I wasn't her anymore. I was someone who'd called the right person at the right moment and refused to let anyone convince me that I'd done something wrong. And that version of myself, I was proud to be her. 6 months after Kendall's sentencing hearing, I stood in front of a room full of investors pitching my first major project since everything had fallen apart. The recovery hadn't been linear. There had been days when I'd wondered if I'd made the right choice. Days when I'd seen my parents' faces in my mind and felt that old, familiar guilt trying to pull me back into silence. But those days became fewer and farther. The Hastings Trust had been fully audited and restructured. Every penny that Kendall had stolen was accounted for and earmarked for repayment. Because the fraud had been so extensive, the trust board decided to release a portion of my inheritance early, about $800,000 that was definitively mine and had never been touched by Kendall's schemes. For the first time in my life, I had real financial freedom. Not the kind of Instagram-filtered fake wealth that Kendall had performed for years, but actual security. The ability to make choices based on what I wanted, not what I could afford. I used some of it to move out of my cramped Brooklyn apartment and into a beautiful loft in a converted warehouse. Nothing ostentatious. I'd learned enough from watching Kendall's downfall to know that real wealth is quiet. But it was mine, and it was exactly the kind of space I'd always dreamed of having. The rest of the money went into starting my own venture capital fund focused on women-led tech startups. I'd spent years as a project manager watching brilliant women struggle to get funding for their ideas, while mediocre men with confident pitches got millions. I wanted to change that, just in my own small way. Rachel joined me as a partner. She had experience in finance that I lack, and more importantly, she understood what it meant to rebuild after someone had tried to destroy you. We made a good team. I had the technical knowledge, and she had the business expertise. And we both had the scars that made us careful about who we trusted. Our fund was small. We started with just my investment and Rachel's savings, but we were selective. And the 3 companies we'd backed in the first 6 months were all showing promising growth. One of them was founded by a woman who'd escaped an abusive marriage and was building an app to help other women safely plan their exits from dangerous relationships. Another was creating affordable housing solutions using modular construction. The third was developing AI tools to detect financial fraud in real time. Every one of them felt personal. Every one of them felt like a direct response to what I'd lived. Kendall completed her community service requirement working at a nonprofit that helped families navigate financial hardship. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, including her. She sent me an email about halfway through her sentence. Not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement. She said she'd been angry at me for a long time, that she'd felt betrayed when I'd exposed everything. But working with people who'd been genuinely victimized by financial abuse had given her perspective she'd never had before. She said she understood now that what Dylan had done to her was a version of what she'd done to me. That manipulation can flow downhill, that being a victim doesn't erase the harm you cause others, and that she was sorry it had taken losing everything for her to see that. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted me to know that she was trying to become someone who deserved it someday, even if that day never came. I read that email 3 times. I didn't respond. I sat with it for a week, thinking about what forgiveness would mean and whether I was ready to offer it. Eventually, I sent a short reply. I told her I appreciated her honesty, that I hoped she continued the work of becoming a better person, and that maybe someday, when enough time had passed and enough healing had happened, we could have a conversation that didn't involve lawyers or courts or criminal charges. But not yet. Not now. She wrote back just 2 words. I understand. My father's trial verdict on all counts. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Less than Dylan, but more than Kendall. The judge said he was particularly troubled by the fact that my father had been an officer of the court who'd sworn to uphold the law while actively breaking it. The disbarment was automatic, his law license was revoked, his partnership at the firm was terminated, and his reputation was completely destroyed. My mother filed for divorce 3 months into his sentence, not because she was angry at him for committing crimes, but because she was angry at me for exposing them. And she couldn't forgive him for getting caught. She moved to Florida to live with her sister. I heard through Margot that she told everyone in her new community that her ungrateful daughter had turned on the family and destroyed their lives, that I was vindictive and cruel, and that she'd disowned me for tearing the family apart. That version of events probably helped her sleep at night. I didn't have the energy to care what she told people anymore. Margot became the family I'd never really had. We had dinner once a week, sometimes just the 2 of us, sometimes with Patricia and Rachel and the other women from Dylan's victims support group. We talked about business, about recovery, about building lives that didn't revolve around performing for other people. She told me she was proud of me, that she'd watched me transform from someone who tried to make everyone happy into someone who demanded to be treated with respect. She said that was harder than it sounded and that most people never managed it. A year after everything started, I got an invitation to speak at a conference about financial fraud and family dynamics. They wanted me to tell my story, not the details of the legal case, but the emotional journey of recognizing abuse and choosing to act despite the personal cost. I almost said no. The idea of standing on a stage and making myself vulnerable in front of strangers felt terrifying. But Rachel convinced me that my story might help someone else recognize the signs before it was too late. That there were probably thousands of people being financially exploited by family members right now, feeling guilty for even questioning it, and that hearing someone say, "I questioned it and I survived," might give them permission to protect themselves. So I said yes. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces in the audience, I told them about the restaurant, about my sister's face when she tried to kick me out, about the phone call that changed everything. But I also told them about the parts that don't make it into news articles. The nights I'd cried because I missed my family, even though the moments I'd wondered if I'd overreact, if I should have just let it, if maintaining relations. I told them that choosing yourself over toxic family doesn't make you it makes you someone who understands require use. And I told them what I wished, that sometimes the family you're born into isn't. That real family are the people who see you for who you are and love you anyway, who celebrate your success instead of undermining it, who protect you instead of exploiting you. The response was overwhelming. People came up to me afterwards sharing their own stories, daughters whose fathers had stolen their inheritances, siblings who drained joint accounts, parents who'd taken out credit cards in their children's names. All of them had felt guilty for even considering reporting it. All of them had been told that family handles things privately. All of them had been made to feel like they were the problem for refusing to be victimized quietly. I gave every single one of them Patricia's card and told them to call her if they needed help, and I gave them something else: permission to choose themselves. That conference led to more speaking engagements. I never set out to become an advocate for financial abuse survivors, but apparently that's what I'd become, and it felt right, like I'd found a purpose that had all along. Rachel and I brought on 2 more partners and expanded our fund. We started mentoring women entrepreneurs, teaching them not just about business, but about protecting themselves from the kind of We created contracts that protected founders from predatory investors. We built networks of women who could warn each other about problematic partners and business associates. We made it harder for people like Dylan to operate in our spaces. 2 years after that lunch at Le Bernardin, I attended Kendall's wedding. Not to Dylan, obviously. They'd divorced months before his trial even ended. But to a man named James, who worked as a middle school teacher and drove a 10-year-old Honda. She'd met him at the nonprofit where she was doing community service. He knew everything about her past. She'd told him on their 3rd date because she'd learned that secrets were what had destroyed her life the first time. He'd accepted her anyway. Not because he was a saint or because he thought he could fix her, but because he could see she'd done the work of changing, that she wasn't the person who'd committed those crimes anymore. The wedding was small, just family and close friends, though family for Kendall now meant mostly James's relatives and a few friends who'd stuck by her through everything. I was the only member of our original family who attended. Our parents weren't invited. When Kendall saw me walk in, she started crying. She came over and hugged me, and I let her. We still weren't close. We probably never would be. But we'd reached a place where we could coexist without destroying each other. She whispered thank you in my ear as she hugged me. Not for forgiving her, she knew I hadn't, not fully, but for showing up anyway, for being willing to witness her attempt at building something real after everything fake had burned down. I watched her marry James in a simple ceremony at a community center, surrounded by people who actually knew and loved her instead of the image she'd projected. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel about my sister again. Hope. Hope that people could change, that they could face the consequences of their actions and come out the other side as better versions of themselves. That redemption was possible, even if forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. Dylan was released after serving 5 years of his 8-year sentence. I heard he moved to a different state and was working as a manager at a chain restaurant. Rachel's victim support group tracked him, not for revenge, but for safety. They wanted to make sure that if he started showing predatory patterns again, there would be people watching and ready to warn potential victims. As far as we could tell, he'd stayed quiet. Prison had changed him. Maybe he'd just learned to be more careful. Either way, he was no longer our problem. My father served 3.5 years before being released on parole. I heard through Margot that he'd moved to Arizona and was working as a paralegal, the only legal job available to someone who'd been disbarred. My mother had remarried during his incarceration, which I learned from a Christmas card she'd sent to Margot that mentioned her new husband's name. She never tried to contact me. I never tried to contact her. We both seemed to understand that some bridges, once burned, aren't meant to be rebuilt. And I was okay with that. More than okay. I'd built a life I was proud of, surrounded by people who actually cared about me, doing work that mattered. I'd learned that you don't owe anyone access to your life just because they're related to you. That protecting yourself isn't selfish. That choosing truth over comfort is the only way to build something. 3 years after that phone call in the hallway of Le Bernardin, I stood in my office looking at a wall covered in photos. Pictures of the women entrepreneurs we'd funded, articles about our successes, a framed copy of the victim impact statement I'd read at Dylan's sentencing, a photo of Rachel and me at the opening of our new office space. And yes, one picture of Kendall and me from when we were kids, before everything got complicated, before money and manipulation and keeping up appearances destroyed what could have been a real relationship. I kept that photo as a reminder, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd learned. That nostalgia isn't a good enough reason to accept abuse. That the past doesn't obligate you to tolerate a harmful present. That sometimes loving someone means loving them from a distance while you protect yourself. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a woman I'd mentored last year, telling me her startup had just closed its Series A funding. She'd invited me to the celebration party and wanted to thank me for believing in her when other investors had dismissed her ideas. I smiled and typed back that I'd be there. These were my people now, the ones who'd built themselves back up after being knocked down, the ones who chose honesty over performance, the ones who understood that success wasn't about looking rich on social media. It was about doing meaningful work with respected. That lunch at Le Bernardin felt like a lifetime ago now, like it had happened to a different person, which, in a way, it had. The woman who'd walked into that restaurant looking for her sister's approval didn't exist anymore. She'd been replaced by someone stronger. Someone who knew her worth, someone who understood that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept less than you deserve, even when the people demanding that acceptance are the ones who are supposed to love you most. I never regretted making that phone call, not for a second. It had cost me my family, my parents, the relationship I'd had with my sister, and the comfortable illusion that blood relations meant something more than they actually did. But it had given me something more valuable than all of that. It had given me myself. And in the end, that was the only thing that really mattered. So that's my story. The whole messy, complicated truth of it. I destroyed my sister's fake charity gala with one phone call, and it exposed a network of fraud that reached further than I could have imagined. Was it worth every single day I wake up knowing the answer is yes? If you're dealing with something similar, if someone in your family is taking advantage of you financially or otherwise, I hope my story gives you permission yourself to make that call, to demand accountability, even when it costs you everything. Because you'll survive the loss of toxic people, but you might not survive letting them continue to destroy you. I'd love to hear from you. If this story resonates, or if you're going through something similar, drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about people who chose themselves and survived, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because there are thousands of us out there, people who made the hard choice, who refuse to be victimized quietly. Understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is save yourself, and we're all rooting.